Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour, yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Now, imagine yourself sitting as a passenger on a Boeing 737-200 in cruise at 24,000 feet, and suddenly a huge explosive decompression rips the roof off the forward part of the cabin. This is exactly what happened on Aloha Flight 243, which I will be covering today. And as a disclaimer, there will be loss of life mentioned in this episode. So if that's something that you're sensitive to, you should probably stop watching right now.
Wind 31016, turn right, turn on. Third land, 31 right.
Delta 260, is produced.
This video is brought to you in cooperation with NordVPN. Now, if you haven't already started protecting yourself on the internet, you really should be doing that. And I have been using NordVPN for the last year or so. That's great when I go traveling and I go to a training center, sit in hotels and maybe using public Wi-Fi's in airport. But to be perfectly honest, the one thing that I use it for the most is because I live down here in Spain, but I still want to watch my favorite TV shows up in Sweden. But nowadays there are all these pesky regional restrictions. So what I do is I just take up the NordVPN app, I choose a server up in Sweden, and voila, all of my favorite TV shows are available to me, and this is great. The NordVPN app is really easy to use, and if you sign up for this deal that I'm linking to down here, then you can use 6 devices on one deal. So that means that you can protect basically your whole household. They're also incredibly fast. They have more than 5,200 servers in 52 different countries scattered out of the globe. And if you choose to use this link here below and the coupon code PILOT, well then you'll get 68% off the 2-year deal, which brings the price down to only $3.71 per month. So go down, click the link and start protecting yourself on the internet today. Okay guys, so this is another episode in my series about famous incidents and accidents within the aviation industry. And as always, I am using the final report of the accident as the basis for this video. If you're interested in knowing more exact details, well then I'm linking to the final report here in the description of the video, and I highly recommend you to go and check that out. It's really interesting. The way that I will do this is I will first give you a full synopsis of what happened, how the flight crew and the cabin crew and the passengers dealt with the incident. And at the end, I will go through the actual reasons behind this accident, what caused it, and what kind of recommendations came out from the final report. So make sure you stay tuned. I know it's a long episode, but there are some really nice details here that you probably won't find in any other way than reading the full report or listening to this video. So this accident actually started early in the morning of the 28th of April 1988. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the first officer of the day started doing his pre-flight work, checking the weather, NOTAMs, and in his base in Honolulu. He went out and he started doing the pre-flight inspections of the 737-200 that he was going to fly for the day. And this pre-flight inspection was done in darkness. The only light that was available was the kind of apron light. And that's going to become important later on, because at the time, the pilots were not required to do pre-flight inspections between each flight. You only need to do a pre-flight inspection in the morning, and then you can continue to fly throughout the day without doing any further inspections. Anyway, the captain came out to the aircraft, the first officer briefed him, said the external inspection was good, there was no findings, and also the tech log was looking good. So they just settled into the aircraft, took on the passengers and started their duty. Now, their first duty started with 3 round-trip flights, so 6 flights, going out from Honolulu to Hilo, Maui in Kauai. So this is the kind of operation that Aloha Airlines did. They were based on Hawaii. They flew intra flights within the islands. Obviously, that would be really, really short hops and climbing only up to a fraction of the maximum altitude of the 737-200. During these first 6 flights, the aircraft performed completely normal. There was no problems with engine indications, no pressurization problems, nothing at all. So completely normal day in the office, basically. Now, at 11 o'clock, it was time for a crew change. So I didn't see if the captain was changed, but for sure the first officer did a crew change. Once again, there was no external inspection done after the crew change. But after the crew change, the captain was now Captain Rob Schonsteimer and First Officer Madeline Tompkins. They did the pre-flight. They flew from Honolulu to Maui and then on to Hilo. So that's the first 2 flights of the day. The third flight was flight 243, all right? The accident flight. On the accident flight, there were these 2 in the flight deck. There was 3 cabin crew, which is the standard crew for a 737-200. There was 89 passengers, and there was 1 air traffic controller that was sitting in the cockpit on the jump seat, was traveling back from Hilo to Honolulu. It was a perfect day. Really, really nice weather over the Hawaiian Peninsula. Beautiful. First Officer Madeline was the one that was flying. She took off from Hilo at time 13:25, climbed up, manually flew the aircraft, as you would, up to 24,000 feet. Up until this point, everything is normal. But as they leveled off at 24,000 feet, they heard this horrendous noise, which was kind of like a pop and a tear. Imagine tearing a pair of jeans apart. When that happened, First Officer Madeline's testimony said that her head was sucked back into her seat and she could see parts of insulation and things starting to fly around inside of the cockpit. So a huge pressure change, obviously. Captain Rob looked over his side and realized that the cockpit door was gone, and behind the cockpit door he was looking out onto blue sky where the first class roof should have been. All right, so obviously a major structural malfunction of the aircraft. Now, when something like this happens, and the aircrew was at 24,000 feet, they're above the maximum of 10,000 feet cabin altitude that is required to be able to breathe safely. So when something like this happens, the flight crew is trained to evaluate the situation first and do what we call an emergency descent. Now, I have done a full video explaining all of the different parts of an emergency descent, and if you're interested in watching that, I'm going to link to it up here. But what you need to realize is that the really most important thing is to get your oxygen masks on. So the flight crew reach for their oxygen masks, put it on, including the jump seating air traffic controller, and the flight crew oxygen worked fine. Okay. So once you have the oxygen mask on, you need to try to establish crew communication. This was not possible because of the horrendous noise that was coming from the open gaping hole in the aircraft structure. And then you're supposed to try to rectify the situation. So those are the first kind of memory items. Obviously, with this kind of structural failure of the aircraft, there was nothing they could do about trying to restore pressurization. So the next step is to initiate the emergency descent, which is always done by the captain as pilot flying, which meant they swapped roles. The captain initiated the emergency descent. Now, here's something that's important to understand. If you watch the video about the emergency descent, there is a point which basically says after you've initiated the initial descent that you can choose whether or not you want to increase the speed or not. Okay? With a higher airspeed, it means that you're going to be descending faster, which means that you're going to be getting down into the breathable part of the atmosphere quicker. However, it's also stated that if structural integrity of the aircraft is in doubt, you should not increase the speed. And that's because you don't want to increase the forces on the aircraft. You don't know what part of the aircraft has the structural damage. So to increase the speed could potentially come with some real risk of an in-flight breakup. However, in this case, the pilots did increase the airspeed. So Captain Rob, as part of his emergency descent procedure, increased the speed between 280 and 290 knots, which is not the maximum speed of the aircraft, which is what it says that we should be doing, but it's a fairly high airspeed. Okay. He stated that the aircraft felt a bit sluggish in the controls and that it was initiating rolls left and right, and this is all kind of indicating that, you know, there's something wrong. All right, and it's likely that the breakup of part of the cabin roof has had an effect either on the structural integrity of the aircraft as such, or that part of the flight controls might have become damaged by the debris from the breakup. Anyway, they initiated the descent. They're now at 290 knots, which means that the noise in the cabin is even higher. So it was impossible for the cockpit crew to communicate with each other. Instead, they used sign language to kind of show what they were doing. Meanwhile, in the back of the cabin, there is absolute pandemonium, as you might understand. Fortunately, all of the passengers were seated in their seats because at that point of the flight, the fasten seatbelt sign was illuminated, so everyone was seated down except the cabin crew. When the breakup happened, it started on the left-hand side, most likely, of the aircraft, forward, approximately where the forward door is. And very quickly, as the structure started breaking up, you had the decompression happening. And the decompression just aggravated the breakup, which meant that the little hole that's opened up in the beginning of the cabin zone to the left side now basically ripped 18 feet of the cabin apart, over the top, and then down to the window level on the right-hand side, and the parts let loose of the aircraft and disappeared. Now, the purser, the number one of the cabin crew, she was standing at row 5 when the breakup happened, and she did not have a chance. Right? As soon as the breakup happened, this happened in the matter of a second, she was immediately sucked out of the aircraft and disappeared. And unfortunately, her body was never recovered, nor was any of the pieces that were actually ripped off the roof. They fell down into the sea, and they could never actually confirm her being dead. She was just presumed being dead because of the nature of the accident. The number 2 was standing at row 15-16, and she was struck down to the floor by the force of the depressurization. But she managed to get up, and she spent the rest of the flight crawling up and down the middle aisle, trying to comfort and help the passengers out. And in the final report, this was described as heroic. Like the fact that she would continue to do her duty and to help the passengers was considered an absolutely fantastic act of heroism. The number 3, the most junior of the cabin crew, was standing at row 2, which is just below the now open roof of the aircraft. She was hit by debris as the depressurization happened. It hit her in her head, and she suffered severe head trauma and was one of the most badly hurt people in the whole flight. The rest of the passengers, especially the ones that were sitting below the now open roof, suffered cuts, lacerations because of the debris flying around. Some of them actually had some electrical burns as well because of the cables that was kind of hanging out now. But since they were all seated with their seatbelts fastened, they were all safe in their seats, and none of them actually died. The only fatality in this whole accident was the purser who was sucked out of the aircraft. There was no communication from this point on with the cockpit crew. Obviously, a lot of the wiring goes through the roof of a 737-200, so the PA system was not working, and the passenger oxygen system didn't work either. But from 24,000 feet, actually you can kind of still breathe there for a few minutes. And the fact that they initiated emergency descent quickly also meant that they were quickly down into breathable air. However, I just cannot even imagine the amount of sound and rushing air that must have come in through the cabin, especially during the high-speed part of the emergency descent. So now, if we go back into the cockpit, the pilots are still doing the emergency descent procedures. And as part of that, First Officer Madeline has now put the transponder code 7700 into the transponder. This is an emergency code that will immediately light up their radar blip on the air traffic controller's screens. And she was also trying to call a mayday call into air traffic control, but because of the ambient noise in the cockpit, it was very hard for them to have any kind of communication going. Eventually, they got down to about 14,000 feet and below, and as they started to level off below the 10,000 feet, Captain Rob reduced the speed back to 210 knots, and because of that, the ambient noise now went down significantly, and they could start to communicate. And with that, they could also communicate with air traffic control. First Officer Madeline was telling them that they had a rapid depressurization, that they were in an emergency, and that they needed emergency personnel. Now, air traffic control did not understand how severe this problem actually was. So they asked for the firefighting crew. They did not ask for ambulance initially. There was continuing problems to talk to air traffic control, because even though the ambient noise level had gone down, it still was extremely high. There was continuous confusion happening, but now the aircraft is diverting towards Maui. Air traffic control can see them squawking 7700. They could hear them having a mayday situation, and they could also see them turning towards Maui. So what the first officer did was she just turned over the radios to Maui approach control to tower, and she continued to talk to tower throughout the rest of this incident. As they're now getting closer towards the runway, they have to start to prepare the aircraft for landing. And the issue here, and I've talked about this in previous videos as well, is that when you have structural problems with the aircraft, you don't really know how the aircraft is going to react when you start changing the configuration of the aircraft. So they started slowing down. The captain asked for flaps 1, flaps 5, which he got. He was still able to control the aircraft, but as they went beyond flaps 5, he felt that the aircraft suddenly started to be harder to control. So he decided that, okay, we will keep flaps 5, right? That configuration seems to work. Let's keep it there. Flaps 5 will give you an approach speed of about 155 knots, so on. But when the captain reduced the speed below 170 knots, once again, the aircraft started behaving weirdly. So he said, all right, we know that flaps 5 works, we know that 170 knots works, let's keep it at that speed. So that's what they did. And this is a show of good airmanship, all right? It's showing that it's better to know that you can control the aircraft at a certain speed, knowing that you're going to land with a higher speed now, need more runway, than to try to go further and potentially lose control of the aircraft at a lower altitude. So they kept it at 170 knots. Now, they selected gear down. All right. And here is where this scenario if this scenario would happen in a simulator, most pilots wouldn't even accept it. All right. Because here's where it starts to get really silly. As they selected the gear down, they got green indications on both main gear, but they got no indication at all on the nose gear. Neither that it was down and locked, so green light, or a red light, which would indicate that it was unsafe. So basically they had no idea what the nose wheel was doing. This turned out to be a completely separate fault. Basically 2 bulbs had gone out in the light kind of structure, but they didn't know this. So they started doing the emergency gear extension procedure for the nose gear. Now, once again, I've done a video about how this emergency gear extension or alternate gear extension works. If you're interested in seeing that, it's up here. But basically, it just means that they pull a wire up to let gravity take care of the gear and let it fall into place and lock. Even after doing that, they had no indication of the nose gear coming down, so the first officer told air traffic control that there's a possibility that we might not have a nose gear. Now, air traffic control is starting to understand that this is a much worse condition than just a rapid depressurization. So at this point, they're calling for ambulances to come towards the airport as well. When Rob is now on approach, remember, up until this point, they've done an emergency descent, which means thrust is set down to idle. They're descending as quickly as they can, and after they have descended down to 10,000 feet, they will still be descending with idle thrust down to their approach altitude, basically. So there has been no need for thrust up until this point. But as Captain Rob is now increasing the thrust on the engines for the approach, which you're going to need to do to stabilize the approach on a 3-degree glide slope, he feels a yaw in the aircraft. Right? The aircraft is yawing to the left, and he quickly realizes that he has no throttle response from the left-hand engine, the number 1 engine. He thinks the engine might have failed, so he puts the start switch to flight to try to reignite the engine. If you put the start switches to flight, it means basically that both of the 2 igniters inside of the engine is going to be continuously igniting to try to get the engine to start again. This had no effect. So now the aircraft is flying with a big part of the roof missing. They have no indication of if the nose gear is extended, and they also have only 1 engine responding. So this is almost silly at this point. But they managed to stabilize the aircraft on approach at 4 miles. They decided they do not want to stay any longer. They've been running through some non-normal checklists, but at this point, the captain is just focusing on getting the aircraft safely down to land. At time 13:58, the aircraft touches down on runway 02 in Maui. It's a completely normal landing. The aircraft comes to a stop on the runway, and as soon as they've stopped, they set the flaps to 40, they run through the evacuation checklist, and they evacuate the aircraft on the runway. Right. This is an amazing feat. They have managed to flown the stricken bird up from 24,000 feet with all of these failures down onto the runway. The only thing that's left to do now is to try to figure out why this happened. What have caused this problem? So the National Transportation Safety Board, they go to work. They come to Maui. They have a look at the aircraft, and they start their investigation into this. And this is where it becomes really interesting. And this is also why this accident is so important in improving the safety overall for all aircraft flying, not only the 737, but every aircraft. So what they find initially is that a section of the overhead part of the structure of the aircraft has been ripped apart. Okay, that they know. They can see that the metal has been kind of shredded in V form below the left-hand side, and they can see that the structure is bent out to 90 degrees over the window level on the right-hand side. And this would indicate that the actual brake started on the left-hand side and it was opened like a can outwards to the right side where it was ripped off. They find parts of the structure inside of the engines. The engine fan blades were damaged on both the left and the right-hand side. Part of the structure is found inside of the engines. And a big part of the structure is actually found wedged between the leading edge devices and the right-hand engine strut. And this part of the structure is really the only thing that they have to go on when it comes to finding why the structure broke up in the first place. They also found that the thrust control cable that was running to the left-hand engine, remember the one that failed on approach, had been torn apart. But we're going to be talking about that later on. So how is it possible that a 737-200 can lose part of its structure in an explosive decompression like that? Well, this is the question that the NTSB had to answer, and they started going to work into looking into the maintenance procedures and the overall manufacturing process of the 737-200 at the time. Now, what's important to notice here is that Aloha Airlines, they were flying very special types of flying for the 737. So when Boeing constructed the 737, it had given it what we call a safe life. So Boeing was saying that up until this amount of hours, this aircraft is going to withstand structurally everything that's needed, and after that you need to go in and do proper inspections of it. And throughout its entire life, at regular intervals, there are smaller, medium and big inspections taking place. So A, B, C and D checks. The D checks includes basically stripping the aircraft down and going through looking at all structural components, looking for fatigue cracks and things like that. Now, the 737-200, the first couple of hundred serial numbers of 200 was manufactured in a slightly different way. Okay, so when you make a body of an aircraft, it is made up from some space out circumferential kind of frames. So picture these round frames that comes on regular intervals. They are held together by horizontal stringers that goes through the longitudinal part of the aircraft. And then between those stringers and those frames, what's actually taking up a lot of the load, especially from the pressurization of the aircraft, is actually the skin of the body. So the skin has to be fastened and has to be manufactured in a way that can take up a lot of loads. So on the earliest variants of the 737-200, the skin was manufactured out of sheets of metal that was 18 feet long, and they were about 0.036 inches thick. These sheets of metal, these sheets of aluminium, was then overlapping what we call lap joints with about 3 inches. So you have the upper skin and the lower skin. And between these 3 inches, when they overlap, they put what we call a cold bonded adhesive. And I know if you're an engineer out there, you're going to laugh at me now, but I'm going to make it simple. Picture a kind of glue strip. Okay. Now, when we say that this glue strip cold bonded, it meant that it was actually reactive in room temperature. So they were kept, these strips were kept on dry ice temperature until they were supposed to be used in a manufacturing process, when they were taken out and then they were brought up to room temperature. As soon as they're at room temperature, they start to be sticky, and then they were put in between these lap joints, and then once they were in between, then they were inserted 3 rows of rivets. Okay, so what's keeping the lap joints together is the overlap, the adhesive, and 3 rows of rivets. Okay. Now, after the manufacturing process, and when these first 737-200s had been operating for a couple of thousand hours, and they were going through these structural D checks, Boeing started to realize that this cold adhesive that had been used, it wasn't great, especially if it was subjected to really humid conditions. And it had a tendency to disbond. Okay, that means basically that the glue doesn't work anymore, it releases. And when it releases, all of these forces that are being caused by the constant pressurization changes in the aircraft is now not taken up by the adhesive as was designed, but it's being taken up entirely by the rivets. Okay, so these 3 rows of rivets. These rivets were fastened in a way to make them flush with the aircraft body. And the only way to do that is you need to sink them in, which means basically that you create a cone-shaped hole in this skin material so that the rivet can go down into that hole and create a flush surface. But this also means that that cone shape creates a weakness in the upper part of the skin. All right, you with me so far? Great. So what happens if the adhesive stops working and the forces are now being subjected only onto these 3 rows of rivets is that you can kind of, after many, many thousands of cycles, there could be cracks starting to propagate out from these rivets. And the rivet row that had the most force onto them was the top rivet row. Boeing knew about this, right? They had done extensive testing, they found this out, they found these micro cracks, and so they went out with what's called a service bulletin to all operators of these early versions of the 737-200, saying that, okay, we've noticed this is happening, make sure that you do this thorough inspection of the adhesive, make sure that you don't have disbonding and there's no corrosion going on in it. And if you find it, this is the way that you fix it. Okay, so this is exactly the way that a manufacturer needs to do. You know, they create something, they verify it, and if they find something that is not operating to specifications, well, then they come up with a safe way of solving it. And Boeing did this. However, the maintenance guys at Aloha Airlines either did not understand the significance of this service bulletin, or they were under time pressure. They tended to do all of their maintenance during night, for example. But in any case, it doesn't seem like this maintenance was being done. Now, on top of this, and to make this even more complicated, is that the structure also contains a fail-safe principle called tear straps. So tear straps are basically straps that are fastened to the skin at regular intervals throughout the entire body. And they're also fastened with an adhesive. This is a hot bonded adhesive, so they're using a different adhesive, and with rivets. Okay, and the function of these tear straps is both to strengthen the overall structure of the aircraft, but also if there would be a crack propagating from the rivets, then when that crack came up and it met one of these tear straps, well, then at that point the structure is much harder, much more secure. So a crack wouldn't be able to propagate past that tear strap. Instead, it would potentially turn 90 degrees and move upward. And what would happen then was, in case these fatigue cracks would have gone unnoticed, which they shouldn't be because they should be checked on regularly, but if that would happen, the crack would only propagate until it reached one of these tear straps, move upward, and potentially the only kind of structural problem that would happen would be that a small flap, which would only be a couple of inches big, would open up. That would depressurize the aircraft, still not great, but it wouldn't be an explosive decompression, it would be a controlled decompression. The forces on the overall body would disappear, and then that part of the aircraft would be able to be fixed later on the ground without any danger to human life. So that was the fail-safe principle, to make sure that you wouldn't have a kind of catastrophic structural issue with the body. Now the thing is, though, that also these tear straps needed to be properly monitored, because as with any kind of adhesive, in the kind of atmospheric situation that Aloha Airlines operated, there was a possibility that those tear straps could disbond as well. So as part of this service bulletin, the maintenance personnel also had to go and check to make sure that these tear straps were properly fastened. Because if they weren't, then a potential crack could continue to propagate from one rivet to the next rivet, to the next rivet, to the next rivet, past the tear strap and onto the next and onto the next and onto the next. And as you can see, if that happens, you could end up with a crack going along the whole side of the aircraft, potentially leading to a much bigger decompression. And as we could see on Aloha Flight 243, this seems to be what had happened. So the combination of these problems they had on the manufacturing of the earliest 737-200s, actually they were the ones that came after, about the first 200, they had a completely different manufacturing process, together with the lack of engineering practices at Aloha Airlines, and also together with the lack of oversight from the management of Aloha Airlines, together with the fact that the FAA wasn't managing the Aloha Airlines properly, all led to the fact that you had these fatigue cracks appearing, going unnoticed, and leading ultimately to this catastrophic failure of the lap joint, leading to this accident. After this, Aloha Airlines went out and they checked the other three of their oldest 737-200s. They found similar cracking happen on two of them, or actually I think of three of them. Two of them were so bad that they were immediately decommissioned and sold for parts and scrap. The third one they were actually managing to rectify so it could continue to fly. So this accident actually became incredibly important for the aviation industry's ability to understand metal fatigue, the importance of monitoring the amount of cycles that an aircraft is subjected to, and how to monitor for and actually work with and fix fatigue cracking if it ever appears. But you might ask yourself, well, what about that engine? What happened? What did the wire to the engine have anything to do with this? Well, it turns out that inside of the pressure vessel, the aircraft is pressurized, both in the cabin where passengers are seated, but also in the cargo bays. But of course, the difference is that in between the passenger compartment and the cargo bay, you have a floor. Now that floor was never intended to be able to keep any pressure, right? It was just there for you to be able to walk on. But when this explosive decompression happened, what happened was that the pressure immediately disappeared from the passenger compartment, but it also needed to disappear from the cargo compartment. And the way that it could do that was just trying to go and rush towards the hole in the front of the aircraft. And it went with such a force when it rushed up towards the hole that it actually bent and cracked the floor beams underneath the hull of the body. Now, inside of the floor beams, you had the wires running, not only for the flight controls, but also for the controls of the thrusts. On the left-hand side, that's where the damage was the biggest, because that's where the hole initiated. And that meant that as the floorboards were now bent upwards, it increased the tension a lot on the wire that was controlling the left-hand engine. This wire was made out of carbon steel, all right? Now, it turns out that this carbon steel was susceptible to corrosion. So it was corroded, and when the tension increased, it snapped. So Boeing had issued a service bulletin on that as well several years ago, saying that these carbon steel wires needed to be replaced by stainless steel cables instead. But once again, for some reason, the maintenance department at Aloha Airlines did not do this. So basically, the final report came with several recommendations, and most of these recommendations was aimed at the maintenance department and the management department at Aloha Airlines, but also the FAA was blamed partially for not having enough oversight over the work of the management and the maintenance procedures at Aloha Airlines. So once again, after this, the airline industry became a much safer place to be because of this. This is an amazing story, all right? And I was so fascinated when I was reading through it, and I hope that you like this video. Now, if you like videos like this, I have a whole bunch of them now in my playlist about accidents and incidents. You can go up and you can listen to other ones. There will be more of these coming, and I'd love to hear what you think about this. What's your take on this whole story? File it in the comments below. Consider subscribing to the channel if you think that I've earned it, and give a like, and also highlight the little notification bell, because like yesterday, I did a spontaneous live stream at 11 o'clock at night yesterday. If you have subscribed but you haven't put the notification bell on, well, then you won't know when I'm doing live streams like that, and you might miss it. So for now, thank you very much for watching. Consider checking out the sponsor of this episode, which once again is NordVPN. You'll get up to 68% on the 2-year deal if you use this link here below and the coupon code PILOT. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Right guys, I really hope that you liked that. If you want more content like that, more aviation content, well then check this out. I hope that you have subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the little notification bell. See you inside of the Mentour Aviation app, and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye-bye.